live stream on and confirmation that we're recording. Thank you. Alfie.
And we are live.
Okay. Welcome everyone to the Environment and Sustainability Scrutiny Committee of the 27th of March. I am your chair today, Lewis Stark, and I will shortly introduce everyone in the room. But before that, I just want to cover a couple of policy items for the Council in terms of video streaming and the use of mobile phones and microphones. The Council is streaming this meeting live on the Herefordshire Council YouTube channel and also making a recording. The recording will be available via the Council's website shortly after the meeting has concluded. Could attendees in the room please keep background noise to a minimum and ensure that mobile phones and the other devices are turned to silent. And because of those that might be zooming in on YouTube, can all members please speak directly into the microphone? Because I do understand there have been occasions when people zoom in and have said they've not been able to hear us speaking. Right. For those that are zooming in, I wish to introduce those in the room. On the committee side, there's myself, as I said, Councillor Davis, Councillor Highfield and Councillor Thomas. We also have in attendance today Councillor Swinglehurst, Deputy Leader of the Council and the lead member on the environment, and more or less a permanent member of this committee. Mark Averill, Ben Boswell and Gareth Ellis as officers to support us in our debate today. And supporting us as a committee, we have Daniel Webb, Scrutiny Officer, Simon Can, Clark, and the most important person in the room, Alfie Rees-Glynos, who's looking after the live stream. Apologies for absence, Clark, item 1.
We've received apologies from Councillor Robert Owens and Ross Cook.
And Ross Cook, Corporate Director, thank you very much. There are no name substitutes, Clark?
No name substitutes.
Okay. Do committee members have any declarations of interest? No, thanks. Minutes, you've all had a chance to read the minutes. They've been published on the website. Are members happy to approve the minutes as a true reflection of our last meeting? All those in favour? Okay, that's confirmed, Clark. Any questions from members of the public?
No questions received from members of the public.
Okay. Questions from members of the council?
No questions from members of the council.
And in record time for me, getting through the front end of the meeting, we now go on to the meat of the meeting today, which is our discussion on net zero. I just want to give a couple of background sort of notes about this as to how I will handle it. Net zero is a huge topic. We could go off at various tangents, but I do want the committee and everyone else today to focus on primarily the ambitions of this council and partners for net zero by 2030 for the county as a whole. Within that, we will also look at the council's own net zero ambitions for the same period for their functions and their operations. In order to give context and direction to our discussion, everyone, I'm going to go through the appendix that was provided by officers. And I'd like to say at this time, I'm very grateful for the covering paper and the appendix that you did provide to the committee. I felt that was very useful. Thank you very much. But I will go through the appendix section by section. I know that when we are debating this topic, we'll probably cut across more than one section, and I'm quite relaxed about that. But I am determined to ensure that we cover this whole appendix in 2 hours. At the end of that, I will have a break so that we can gather any recommendations that the committee wants to make, and then I will bring those recommendations back to the committee after a short break. That should leave us enough time to cover the last 2 items on the agenda, which is our work programme, and we can cover what we discussed yesterday, and a chair update from me about progress on responses to our recommendations from previous meetings. Starting with the introduction, I'm going to bring in Councillor Highfield at this stage because he wants to raise the whole issue of the meaning of net zero and what its implications are as really a background to the whole debate we're going to have today. Because I think everyone round the table has to have a common view of what we mean by net zero. Otherwise, we're talking at cross purposes. Councillor Highfield, can I pass the baton to you, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I'd like to address our council officers who are working on this project and ask them what they understand net zero to be. I don't know which of you wants to answer this, but could you do that first, please?
I think net zero can be defined quite simply as zero emissions of greenhouse gases from the council's operations. That doesn't necessarily mean to say that those emissions themselves are zero, but that the net result is zero. So therefore, any emissions that are produced are offset, or another word, inset, in some way. And that's usually from the natural environment, being able to remove carbon dioxide in particular from the atmosphere. So it offsets or eliminates, nets off some of the emissions that are produced, and you resulting in zero overall greenhouse gas impact emissions.
Thank you. Yeah, that broadly meets the agreed international definition. And are you aware of what the implications are of that for, let's say, 1st of January 2030, when and if we meet our target of net zero? Do you understand what the implications are for that date?
The implications on the council's services and functions?
No, the fact that that will be the date on which this county is exercising the maximum warming effect on the environment. That's what it means. Because the warming gases that we're emitting gradually, the net amount that we're emitting gradually reducing to the point where we're even. There's as many leaving the atmosphere as there are entering from us. But that means all those gases that we're emitting for the next 6 years are there. Methane does disappear rather more quickly, but CO2 takes centuries to naturally leave the environment. So when we reach net zero, we're not adding to the amount that's already there, but that amount will already be there. So the amount of warming effect will continue to increase until the point we reach net zero. And at that point, it will be the maximum it will ever be for this county. Are you aware of that fact?
Yes.
Good, because that has implications of what we're trying to achieve here. And when we talk about net zero, there's a lot of figures in your paper that you're going to work through in a minute. But in there, it doesn't clarify this point. Most politicians, for example, don't understand that. Most members of the public think that's when we cease warming the atmosphere anymore. And that is not the case. And it's quite scary, especially as the nation is going to be targeting 1st of January 2050, as is the world. So 26 years more of increasing the amount of warming that is being done to the atmosphere. And we're already 1.5 degrees over the pre-industrial levels. And in the papers, when we talk about what net zero is, we talk about percentage reductions. It is not clear to me reading the paper, and I hope you'll be able to explain when you go along, just what it is we're reducing to. For example, in there, it doesn't include the fact that, you know, we look at the three main gases, CO2, methane, and NOx. The methane certainly will naturally disperse more quickly. If we, for example, got rid of all the cows tomorrow and we had less methane coming in the air, what's left would disappear within decades. But the CO2, if we don't do anything, will be here for centuries. So that was the point that I wanted to establish as a baseline before we go in and talk about this thing, because I think it's widely misunderstood. I think the most members of the public think net zero is the point at which we're no longer warming the atmosphere anymore, and that is not the case. It is the point at which we exert the maximum warming on the atmosphere. So that's it, Mr. Chairman.
If I can add to that, and this is about a debate about the implications of our net zero ambitions. We have a 2030 endpoint for the ambitions for both the county-wide net zero impact and councils on operations. Have we given any thought within the council as what we do beyond that? I've had discussions with the past cabinet member for the environment in the last administration, where I did point out that in order to stabilise the climate, you have to be looking to reduce the CO2 emissions in the climate. How you do that, obviously, there's a number of ways we might do that, which we could touch upon later in terms of carbon sequestration, directly drawn CO2 from the atmosphere and that. I don't want to get too much into solution mode, but has the council or officers thought about what happens beyond 2030 and how do we continue in terms of trying to have a positive impact on the environment as far as we can in Hertfordshire?
Am I coming through okay? So I suppose just firstly the 2030 target is extremely ambitious. It's good, and I think you touched on it earlier, Councillor Highfield, that the national target is obviously slower than that. So it's great to have such an ambitious target and good progress towards it. I think in terms of beyond that, I mean, what the council does in its kind of management, the carbon management plan, we do it in 5-year chunks. So I think currently in our third carbon management plan. We'll be developing the fourth one next year, well this year, later this year, early next year, really, which will then take us to the net zero. So in short, I guess not in detail because we're doing them in that manner. We've set the target as 0. I think in principle it would be looking at how we go further than that, looking at how we look to become more carbon negative and have a wider benefit. But we haven't set any targets on that yet at the moment. The focus is on achieving the net zero target. But it plays into a lot of other things. So at the moment, we're working on the nature recovery network mapping and strategy, which is looking around biodiversity net gain, and a lot of that's going to feed in with the broader sequestration of greenhouse gases as well. So it's bringing those together. And I think at the moment, our focus over the past, since probably 2008 when we did the original baseline, it's all been around reducing consumption, efficiencies. And then we've got a hierarchy that we've set out within the strategies. And so I suppose the latter part of it is around the offsetting and getting into the negative side of it. But to date, it's all been around efficiencies, using less, being just reducing at point source and then looking later. So in short, I think the answer is not in detail, really. I think the focus has been on achieving net zero. But the approach beyond that would be looking at how we can become carbon negative.
I mean, it's just a thought, because obviously it is down to the administration to think about it. We have a big economic plan to 2050. We don't have a big environment plan to 2050. We have a county plan, and we will be touching upon some of this later on, which doesn't say much about net zero. We have a local plan. I don't know much will be said about that. And while I'm not expecting the committee to get into the merits or otherwise of all these plans and strategies that we might talk about today, it just seems to me, and I think it seems to the committee talking to them, that there's this gap, that while we have these longer term plans, particularly on the economic side, and it is the Economic and Environment Directorate, there isn't the same sort of scope or the same sort of push to do something on the environmental side. And we can touch upon it later. But I know, Ben, you've been very keen about us using our natural landscape, our natural capital, to offer to other sides in terms of offsetting. And we can talk about that later on in terms of plant more trees and being able to do that. It's the lack of any sort of obvious long-term planning on that worries me. And while I'm not necessarily saying we will come out with a recommendation on that, I don't know what you think, Councillor Swinglehurst, but I would have thought that even now, before you get to the end of 2030, it would be useful to think about a parallel big environment plan, since we are really quite a rural county. And although we have a vibrant economy, most of our economy is based around our natural capital in terms of tourism. Councillor Swinglehurst. That's somebody answering, I think.
I think that's quite an interesting thought. But I suppose the thing is, if you look at the local plan and the timeline of the local plan, you think, well, why don't we have that same timeline for climate change? But obviously, climate change is embedded within the local plan. So all of this is already embedded in plans that have a longer timeline. Whether there's merit in, as it were, replicating those into a plan that's specific, I think is worthy of consideration. Definitely. We also have to bear in mind what the purview and purchase of the council is on this issue. So we would have our plan to net zero, and I think definitely we would want to look beyond that. We want to go negative, and just continue this this drawdown as we can, as far as we can go. But how are we going to do that? It's through the policies that are in these other plans. So that's, but I think it's a really interesting idea, and in a sense the optics of that make it look as if we have a long-term plan for, the economy or whatever, and we're not considering climate change and the environment through the same lens, or despite the fact that it's actually integrated. But so I think it's an interesting thought. I think I'm perfectly happy that we should take that way and give that a due consideration, whether a kind of a plan that's an extrapolation, as it were, of existing plans would be
Ben?
worthwhile.
Yeah, I think just to build on that. So I suppose there's two plans really, isn't there? There's the council has its own commitment to become net zero by 2030,
Yeah,
and we have the carbon management plan that sets out that strategy, and then obviously every 5 years we do a new plan that sets out how we're going to deliver that along the way, and we do the annual reporting. So that's the overarching for the council, and it's also embedded within the council's environmental policy, and it's embedded within the council's decision making. I think that was a previous recommendation of the scrutiny committee. So all council decisions are taking that on board. It's through business cases for capital development. It's a golden thread through policies within the council. So for the council itself, as I say, there is an overarching plan and action plan reporting, and then it's a golden thread, and it has to be because it's so wide-ranging. It touches everything the council does, so it needs to be in that way. So just drawing a recent example, obviously we had the waste strategy, and one of the key targets from the waste strategy is the net zero target within that, and that was a key consideration of the redesign of the service and the procurement, etc. So that's just an example of where that's come forward. Then on a bigger scale, you've got the county-wide target, and that target then is currently within the county plan, which is the sort of council document. It's also a golden thread through each of the other documents you mentioned in terms of making sure that that's within them. And then in terms of how that's brought together, and I think it's covered later on in the report, we've established the Climate Nature Board, Climate Nature Partnership Board, again, which was a recommendation of the predecessor to this group, to work with partners, communities, residents, anchor institutes and businesses to work on that, I suppose, collective target, because the council is 1%, broadly speaking, of the emissions in the county. So it's how do we work together on that wider 99%. So there's that joint commitment, and then there's the emerging action plan, which has had quite a lot of progress in recent months. And then again, that is following through in all of the strategic documents as they come forward as a golden thread. So I don't know if that helps to sort of show the picture a bit more.
Sorry,
Yes, it was last year that the council agreed to have a target of net zero by 2030. That was 7 years in advance of the date. And so when we talk about 5-year plans now for achieving that net zero, some major projects will cross over beyond 2030. And were we as a council, which I think we should, have a target for after 2030 of a net minus, whatever level we choose, but we need a net minus target for, let's say, 2035, and some projects like the bypass will stretch through that, and the ability to meet a net minus, because they're required to be carbon neutral under current rules, but if it's a net minus, then they're going to require more effort, and that they'd be needing to know that now as we're working towards contracts and so on for this. So I think, and I don't know if you would agree with me as council officers, I think we need a net minus target soon for that.
Councillor Swinglehurst?
Just a couple of points. One is, to bear in mind that anything that's an additional thing to do will take capacity away from what we're doing. So that's just, please bear that in mind in everything. The target wasn't set last year. It was set with the original declaration in 2019. And it was set by the councillors, by the elected members in the declaration. It wasn't set by officers. So if it were to change, it would be appropriate that was the mechanism to use if we want to go net negative. I would suggest at the moment to consider that would be when we've achieved net zero. Because otherwise it just sort of feels like we're being very ungrateful. We're already pushing very hard, very fast, and achieving a great deal. And if we just keep saying, sorry, it's not enough, it's not enough, it's not enough, given that actually if Herefordshire went net negative tomorrow, it would have very little impact on global climate change. But it has a very definite impact on our local economy, on how we function, on the capacity of the council and everything else. So we have to kind of see these things in the whole as much as possible.
Well, maybe now is not the right time, but 2030, when and if we achieve net zero, is far too late to be looking at net minus. We need ongoing plans to make sure that we continue the journey. As you said, 2019 or 2018, that's 11 years. We were making plans.
It could
for net
form a
zero
recommendation that we should consider it. The things that would come up in the 5-year plans anyway, the carbon management plans, which do this and they iterate forward. So we're not going to get to a point and go, right, woohoo, that's done that then. No one's going to do that. So there will always be a 5-year kind of block of time. We're saying, well, we're going to get to here, and therefore we need to get to there. And now we've got there, let's get to there.
Because the argument that our effect as a county on the global warming is true, but it's not a persuasive argument. That if that were the case, we wouldn't bother to do anything, because our effects globally are going to be minimal.
No,
but that's not the argument that we follow, is it?
No, we do everything that we can do.
We do everything we can do, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to move on now to the next section, but I would like to have an action point, not a recommendation, that you do look at a big environment plan, similar to the big economic plan. So, Clark, can we take that as an action point? Because I do take Councillor Highfield's concerns here, but I accept what you say, Councillor Swinglehurst, about capacity and everything else. So if we leave it as an action point, then it's easier for you to decide what you want to do. But I do want to put a marker in the ground here about the impact of climate change necessarily being negative on all the various businesses and other concerns around the county. One of the gaps in the county plan that I raised at the last briefing meeting was tourism. We do not focus on tourism as a council. We've neglected it for years. We've left it to others to do, like the bid. We've left it to individual B&Bs in my ward who complain about lack of support and everything else to do. Creating an image of a county that is concerned about making the environment as good as it can be for visitors, to me is a hugely positive message and will have a huge impact on our economy, because tourism is one of the biggest parts, if not the biggest part of our economy. So I think there's an issue around here, and I don't know how we deal with it, Councillor Swinglehurst, in terms of this particular meeting, but I just feel we're not taking enough advantage of the work that we can do on the environment, having a positive impact on the economy for all those businesses that rely on tourism for their profits. Councillor Swinglehurst, I don't know where to take this, because obviously I can have a recommendation that says that the county plan, the new county plan and the new local plan should be explicit about what our net zero ambitions are. And I'm quite happy to do a recommendation on those lines. And you could come back and say, well, it's embedded in some respects throughout the various plans, but it's not just explicit. But I'm concerned we're missing a trick here, and I don't really know how we pick it up even in a recommendation. Councillor Swinghurst, I need some help here.
I'm sort of in the same place as you, though. I'm not. Yes, I can see there's something there. I can see that we have a lot of, a lot of the USP of the county sits with the environment, and actually, you look at the glamping, and it's about sustainable, low impact tourism. That seems to be a USP for us. But how do we shape that within this? I'm struggling with where the connection needs to sit, because it's clearly something that's emerging, and it will emerge more. And it will undoubtedly, we will see this becoming. And if we can get that message right, that what we are as a county that is forward thinking on this, that's on the front foot, that values our environment, protects it, enhances it, and is looking at sustainability in all things, then that by and of itself feeds into a really positive story about tourism, that you're not coming here to exploit, you're coming here to celebrate. But we don't, you're right, the council does not by and large mantle over that particularly. But whether this is something that we maybe would take away and explore with partners, who are doing that work, BID and so forth, that might be where we can just progress it a step and then sort of see where that goes.
Because we need to be valuing our visitors. I mean, that's key. I could put down, I think I will put down a recommendation, Councillor Swinghurst, about just drawing your attention to the county plan and the local plan, the what that's going on it, and please just look at the net zero impact of those and how we can exploit it almost. I think that would be quite useful for you to at least have as a reminder about this. But there is something missing here, and we could take the lead on this. And for example, you get places like Visit Yorkshire. I get emails from Visit Wiltshire, and they're all extolling the natural capital and of their counties. And we've got that in loads here, and I don't think we take enough advantage of it. I want to move on now, or we'll never finish in 2 hours. But at this point, I'd like to welcome Councillor Pebbody online. Justine, can you see and hear me?
Yeah, I can. Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. You know you can't vote in the recommendations, but please do get involved in the debate. And if you do want to raise any issues, put your hand, please, and I'll then bring you into the debate. Okay?
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks. Can we move on to the next section, which is the council's own greenhouse emissions? And thank you very much for the statistics that you set out there. I've got some questions around where we are in terms of the 3 parts of the plan, Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3, and we can explain what they are for those that are zooming in at the moment. Does any of the members want to come in at this point on any of the statistics that are there? Because that was something that you mentioned, Councillor Highfield, you had an interest in.
I'm deeply interested, but can we maybe listen to the explanations of the paper first, and then maybe there'll be a few comments that are obvious. Yeah.
Ben or Garth, would one of you like to just explain to those that might be on YouTube how we've divided up the our net zero plan into 3 scopes areas, and then perhaps give us a bit of background about where we are in terms of progress? Okay,
certainly.
Thank you.
The council has produced a report in this format, or similar to this, since 2008, 2009. The purpose of this reporting is not just to quantify from a particular year, but to track the change over time. And that is the important part of the purpose of recording these emissions. It's not just to record them, it's to record how they change over a period of time. It is produced in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is an international sort of standard that outlines how organisations, businesses and councils and others should report their greenhouse gases, and they divide them into 3 what are termed scopes, which are 3 sources of greenhouse gases. Scope 1 are fuels that the organisation burns directly, so that's our gas, our petrol, our diesel, things that we actually combust. Scope 2 is our power that we buy in. So we buy in the electricity which we consume, but of course it's generally generated elsewhere. Scope 2 can also include if you're buying heat from a heat network or steam, buying energy in, which the council doesn't. We buy in electricity. Our Scope 2 emissions are where there's been the biggest change because the council has moved to 100% renewable, and that allows us to count those electricity units as zero emissions. And Scope 3 is the emissions that are part of the council's value chain. So these are our partners and principal contractors, but it also includes the staff doing commuting, staff working from home, staff mileage, and as I said, those principal partners that we work with on the largest contracts. I think the important thing, a lot of people find Scope 3 is where the difficulty is because they are the slightly indirect emissions. Council services have obviously evolved quite a lot since 2008, 2009, and that sort of has an impact on the, how the emissions are have changed over time. And I think for most organisations, the big challenge is those Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 and 2 we can do things about really quite directly. Scope 3 is a lot more challenging.
Councillor Highfield, do you want to come in at this stage or before I come in?
Well, it's an overall question. What is the target for the county of Herefordshire in tonnes of CO2 for net zero? I mean, how many tonnes of CO2 are we allowed to emit as a county which equals net zero, i.e. the amount that's disappearing from the environment of Herefordshire? Is that calculatable? Do we have a number for that?
In the county figures that UK government provide for us, they show because of the rural nature of the county, our land use decisions, the amount of pasture and the amount of woodland and other land use in the county actually has a very significant carbon sequestration value. I think it's about 150 or 160,000 tonnes of carbon. So ultimately from net zero, you could argue that the county could produce that much and it would be offset by the land area of the county. Obviously, Herefordshire has the capacity to do that in a way that certain urban authorities don't, because they simply don't have the square miles and acres of pasture and woodland to absorb their emissions.
So does that give us a specific number to target? Because we're measuring all our emissions in the equivalence of tonnes of CO2. So do we have a target of tonnes of CO2? That's the target for net zero. That's the limit of the tonnage that we can chuck into the air.
So I suppose for both county-wide and council, I mean, the net target is zero, because it would be that there'd be no more going in than's coming out.
No, yeah, but that means we got to know. That doesn't make sense. It's not zero gross, it's zero net.
Yeah.
So we need to know how much is leaving, turning into trees or going off into space, and how much we're putting in. And there must be a number that we have that says how much the sequestration is worth, our existing trees, new growth, how methane disappears naturally, and so on. There's a number, and that's how much we can emit. Do we have that actual number?
So I misunderstood then. So as Gareth says, we know what the current sequestration is within the county from the current land use we have. We obviously have strategies such as the local nature recovery network, biodiversity net gain, where we want to grow that and we want to enhance wildlife. We want to regenerate wildlife sites, etc. So we want to be looking at increasing that offsetting figure naturally. So I don't think we have a number that says this is the amount of carbon we will be able to permit or how much we will sequestrate in 2030 at this time. I suppose that's maybe something we can do some further work looking at modelling that, thinking where we will get to. I think what we've taken is very much that hierarchy approach in terms of that demand reduction, efficiency, then to generate renewable energy. And it's kind of then looking at what's left that needs offsetting, as opposed to saying we need to generate an amount of offsetting to have an allowable amount of carbon. I think that almost looks at it the wrong way. It's about, you want, especially if we're going to be looking at getting into negative, it's about how do we absolutely minimise our consumption and be as efficient as possible, then have renewable sources of energy that enable us to meet as much of that need with minimal amount of carbon, and then it's around what's left there. That is then how do we offset that, and again we know how much the natural offset is at the moment. We have plans and strategies to enhance that. So yes, am I helping? I don't have a
Sort
definitive
of,
number
yes,
for you,
yes.
but
I
in
mean,
terms
we're
of a
sort of on
strategy-
the same framework. I think it needs to be made very, because we need to do two things. We need to reduce our emissions and we need to increase our sequestration until they meet. That equals net zero. We have a number now, I believe, for what is the existing amount of carbon dioxide and methane and NOx that our environment is absorbing. And we need, but I don't think it's enough to say, okay, we'll just focus on reducing our emissions and then later see how much we have to improve the two should be happening together so that we bring the two together. And do we have any targets of what we can do? How much, for example, in tons of CO2 would a field of an acre of trees give us, just as a number? I mean, do we have any numbers like that tells us, well, we can get that many thousands of tons out by planting this many trees, for example?
Not quite as simple as that, but we can work that out. No, thank you. We can do those calculations. I can't do that off the top of my head in terms of,
Okay, well,
there's a lot of factors at play there, but we can do estimates and
I
work
promised the chairman I wouldn't go on too much, so perhaps we can think about that as for a recommendation later, Mr. Chairman, about how we get some more numbers so we can make the targets clearer.
But if you can put a form of words together, can I turn us to page 17, please, of the appendix? Because I did say we'd go through the appendix, so I feel obliged to actually start looking at it in more detail. Now, you've explained for everyone looking in the three scopes. I'm very grateful for that, Gareth. It seems that the biggest challenge, as you rightly say, is in scope 3, where we're only, whatever you might think about the data, we're only standing at 30% of what we want to achieve by 2030. Now, I assume that other 70% we're talking about in scope 3 has to come from that top pie chart other than Herefordshire Council itself. Is that right for our own net zero ambitions, Gareth? Not county-wide, but just our own net zero ambitions. That top pie chart
On page 3?
Page 17 I've got here.
Oh, yeah, probably page 3 of the report for 17 of the report.
Page 3, yeah, sorry, I've got
There
a
we are.
different page number now.
Yes, that's correct. That was that's
Right.
the emissions divided by the source in terms of the organisation, which produces
Where are
it.
we going to get the 70% from, and how are we going to achieve that?
I think that is partly spelled out in the current management plan, and will need to form an important part of the next carbon management plan for the county.
Councillor Swinghurst, this is where I see this dichotomy here, or that we have these individual net zero plans, but how well is that getting reflected in the overarching plans that we have? For example, the county plan, and when the local plan emerges. We will talk about levers later on, Councillor Swinghurst, in the appendix, and we can touch upon that. But that was my concern when I even introduced this topic earlier on. How are we taking that particular challenge to get that 70% from these organisations in this pie chart and reflecting that in what our priorities might be at the higher level in terms of moving forward? In terms of decisions we're taking, all sorts of issues there moving forward.
So I suppose there's a number of aspects to that in terms of, so take for example some of the contracted services within that. So again, I'll use the waste example just because it's very recent. So again, as we re-procured the waste service, we made sure that the target within that was around absolutely minimising carbon emissions from the outset. Within that, there's a requirement of our partners there to come up with a carbon management plan, to adopt our target, to work with us on producing carbon management a plan really, and coming forward to work with us on how we achieve that. So we've contractualised that as part of it. So it's using those our commissioning and procurement opportunities there, isn't it? And it's embedding those targets into those major contracts. So, for example, there from 1st September, we'll have the 2 electric vehicles powered by 100% renewable energy. We've looked at opportunities to bring in HVO as an alternative fuel, which is lower carbon, and how we can introduce that potentially later through the contract. We've looked at, currently looking at introduction of replacing sort of I've forgotten the word now, the hydraulic bin lifts with electric bin lifts coupled with small solar units on the top of RCVs as a way of reducing the miles per improving the miles per gallon and reducing diesel use. So it's all of those type of activities that has come through the fact that through our commissioning we've contractualised that target to make sure that they're on board with our approach, working with us as our strategic, as a key partner to deliver that, and then. So that's just, I suppose, one example of a major contract where we've taken that, and the benefits of that will then fall through, as from 1st September and beyond as we work with them to further achieve that target. So it's looking at all of our contracts in contract as to where the opportunity is and working with partners to support them. It's also looking at, I suppose, every time we go back out to tender, that we can then sort of put more into there and go further, as well as working with our partners in terms of promoting energy efficiency measures, energy efficiency audits, supporting them with with grant funding applications to be able to invest in reducing that. So, sorry, it's such a broad question because it covers so many different things we do. But does that give you an example of some of the approaches we've taken?
But we don't have a plan to get that 70%. That's the point I'm trying to make. We know we're 70% short. We know roughly where the sources of that 70% can come from in terms of this pie chart. And I accept what you're saying, Ben, about when it comes to individual decisions, and I want to raise a potential recommendation in that area as well, but I'll do that in a minute. What I'm not seeing is how you plan over the next 6 years to get that 70% that you need in order to get scope 3 down to zero, net zero. That's what I'm saying. And then within that, you might prioritise, as you rightly say, decisions in this area or when you're in new contracts, taking advantage of that. But I don't see the overall sort of plan to progress that at the moment.
So so we're currently towards the end of our 3rd carbon management plan at the moment, and within that plan, I think it's right towards the end. I don't know if we appendix it as a link, but it's on the website. That sets out where we were looking at we modelled different scenarios essentially of when we set the 75% interim target, we looked at what do we think we can achieve, and sort of did a confidence level on that with high confidence, low confidence, and then set the target in the middle. So within that plan, the low confidence was a 65% reduction, the high was 83, target was 75. And within that, we've got detailed plans and spreadsheets that say these are all the planned interventions in each year that will then enable that, and they span each of the scopes, if that makes sense. So the waste contract was part of that plan, and that comes forward, and then as we do others, that will come forward as well. And the challenge, I guess, really is developing this new plan, isn't it? And I think that's where we'd welcome, I suppose, input and suggestions again, because we're now finalising the plan for the next 5 year, which then needs that level of detail behind it as well. So it's going into that. So I can pull up on screen, or I can recirculate the current carbon management plan, which has that level of detail to get us to our 75 for the interim target. To take that further to the 100%, that's the work that's being done at the moment in terms of pulling together the next carbon management plan as we speak.
Yeah. When you look at the decision documents and the environment assessment section of that, it very rarely talks about our net zero ambitions as a council. It very rarely talks about the targets we have to meet over the next few years as a council. And that's my concern. Wow, you've got your carbon management plan sitting over there that you're desperately trying to achieve. It's not an influencer on all the decisions that the council has taken from time to time in order to make sure that every time you try and achieve something, we don't have another council decision that completely offsets it or frustrates it, as I said, to the scrutiny officer. So one recommendation I've got, which I think is quite a simple one, and it's for the committee, is that when it comes to the environment assessment impact in each of those decisions that the council takes, there should be a paragraph on the net zero implications and how we're going to mitigate them. Because if that carbon management plan just sits to one side and is not being looked at or at least considered by everyone within the council, then there's a real danger here that when they come to decisions, particularly decisions to do with outsourcing and contracts that we don't necessarily have direct control over on a day-to-day basis, that we'll end up with decisions that will actually undermine us rather than helping us, or at least not making it any worse. So I think a recommendation for that to be in the environment assessment section of each decision would be useful. What I'm concerned about is capacity, obviously, for people to be able to do that. But I don't see how you can not enshrine what you're trying to do in the carbon management plan at the heart of our decision making within the council. You agree, Councillor Swinghurst? Yeah. So we'll capture that. Yeah, you want to comment?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, because we already have, obviously we have it within the decision matrix as environment. So this is about saying, can we, kind of split it off or put an additional focus into net zero? I don't see that as being particularly onerous, so it's a good idea. Okay. Yeah, good with that.
It's strengthening the guidance.
Councillor Thomas.
There is one thing missing with all this, cost. We can have, like the county plan that we looked at, fantastic, a utopia, but what's it going to cost? And who's going to pay the bill? We cannot go on, every year putting our rates up by the maximum amount, because sooner or later there's a lot of kickback already about the rates this year. We just cannot go on. So we've got to have a balance here between what we're trying to achieve and what it's going to cost. We can't reduce everybody to sackcloth and ashes just to get this magic figure, which is far greater than 2030 when the country is 2050. Now I suspect when the government come out with 2050, they realise the cost implication, and that's not been mentioned now. So I'm just a bit concerned about that.
I suppose the approach we've had, and I've reiterated that strategy about demand reduction, efficiency, generating our own. I mean, over the past, I say since 2008, we've reduced our emissions by 60% to date. That, I would say, has had a significant benefit in terms of financial savings to the authority in delivering that. So I suppose when we first centralised the energy budget corporately, it was costing us in the region of £1.4 million. 10 years later, we're paying significantly less than that with compound interest, because we've invested in energy efficient measures. We do it on a business case approach. So it's very much, environmental business is good business, and we're trying to, very much taken that approach. We've also looked at a lot of environmental investments. So we've seen electric solar panels on most of our estates tailored to meet the needs. Typically, they paid back with probably between 5 and 8 years, depending on where they are. Most of those have already paid back, and they're generating ongoing savings for up to 20 years. We've got some income streams through feed-in tariffs, which are things we invested in a long time ago that are going back into supporting services. When we did the fleet review several years ago, we looked at how do we get a fleet that works for the council, that delivers services, but also has environmental performance at its heart. And so we introduced I think it was the 6 fully electric pool cars, the 5 hybrids. We made more efficiency into our fleet, massively reduced our carbon, reduced our running costs significantly, because the business case was there that it costs less to do. So it's not always a case of saying reducing carbon is going to cost you a load of money. It does get tougher. So I'm not saying it's not all going to be there. The business cases become harder, but we are seeing the benefit and the savings and the cumulative benefits and savings over a number of years from the actions we've already taken. So I would say in the nets, you know, I wouldn't be anticipating it to be costly because we've already seen huge savings from the 60% we've already saved.
Councillor Highfield.
Yeah, perhaps to reassure my colleague here, if you look at the cost of electricity that's supplied to the grid from the various sources, now wind-powered electricity, which has got its shortcomings, but in actual cost is, if we had only the latest new turbines, it would be the cheapest. It would be cheaper than coal or any other source of electricity. Because we've got some legacy turbines that have been in place for a few years, it isn't quite at that level, but it's far cheaper than gas, nuclear, or any of the others. So green initiatives, if carefully thought out and invested in, can actually not only be equally, they can be cheaper. So I want to reassure you on that point, but there are risks. Some things end up being more expensive, and hopefully you can make that up with other things that you've done that are cheaper and more effective. Maybe while I'm on this point, can I come up with another point, Mr. Chairman? Yeah, well, we've got this pie chart which shows where our emissions and the end users are coming from, and some of them are, as you know, rather difficult to address. And one of them is transport, obviously. We have a problem with the infrastructure in this county if we're trying to introduce electric vehicles. But so many organisations within government, within local and national government, are confusing themselves because they get confused between pollution and global warming. And you can see an example of this when ministers talking about it often describe things as being polluting when they actually mean they're causing global warming, or vice versa. And Transport for London honestly seem to be completely blind to this. For example, I can drive my 22-year-old Vauxhall Vectra into the ULEZ zone and not pay, but I can't drive my relatively newer diesel Fabia into the area without paying. And yet my Fabia produces half the greenhouse gas emissions of my Vauxhall Vectra because it's diesel. They think it's polluting, right? Well, maybe it is slightly more polluting, but we're talking about global warming. It is twice as good as driving that petrol Vectra into the ULEZ zone, and we don't want to make the same mistake. We don't want to undermine ourselves by getting the two things mixed up. And so we certainly at the moment cannot afford to demonise diesel, because overall it produces less greenhouse gas emissions, even if it does come with a few environmental issues that need to be dealt with. But those are local in their effect, whereas global warming is existential. So I wanted to make the point that there are opportunities within transport by not necessarily dogmatically following what's going on in London or in central government. Thanks.
Do you want to respond to that, Ben?
I suppose I'm not entirely sure how to respond, because I'm not sure. I suppose the point there is just considering the balance, climate emissions and local pollutants in the balance in terms of, I suppose we've got, you know, as I say, local air quality zones in both Hereford and Leominster, so we're obviously looking to reduce air quality pollutants there in terms of PM10, NOx, etc. So we'd have those. But I think I take the point. I'm not sure there's a question there. Sorry.
All I'm saying is they're trying to reduce pollution, things that harm people's health, is a good thing. But which is the priority at the moment? Global warming is a far bigger threat than pollutants, to be perfectly frank, within a certain level. So we mustn't undermine our efforts to meet our net zero targets by introducing measures that will reduce pollution.
Councillor Swinglehurst?
No, just to reassure you on that point, we're not planning on doing anything to demonise diesel vehicles, but we are interested in looking at alternative fuels like HVO, which in a lot of diesel engines as a simple swap in fuel, which you know is worth considering. But yes, you're right. I mean, there's a balance of things to look at here.
I'm going to,
Thank you, Chair. As we were talking renewables, I just wanted to find out if there's any planned increase in land usage for renewables, so the likes of wind, solar, bioenergy, hydro, etc., to sort of offset some of our costs or to reduce net carbon, by using renewables. I know you said electric is already classed as net zero, but further future use within the county? We've got any planned expansion?
Well, I think many things like solar farms, wind, they'll come through private applications and nothing to do with us. What we've done is put solar panels on roofs that we own, and on the estate that we already own, and I think we would continue to do that on a case by case. Where business case can be made, that we should progress that. And so in a sense, the answer is yes, but we're not buying land to do it. But nevertheless, it's something that will be happening, anyway, as a normal planning issue.
Should we not be encouraging those organisations that would be perhaps keen to do that kind of thing, providers?
Yeah, so just to add to that, so oh God, it must have been 18 months ago, probably 2 years ago, we had the Citizens Assembly, and from that came a number of recommendations and a programme of works. And through that, what we've done is we've developed some really up-to-date renewable energy feasibility mapping that we're putting on the website and making it available for people. And the idea there is to really help people to understand where renewable energy could, to help them understand the opportunities for that. So it's almost an opportunity mapping layer on the website to do exactly what you've just said. So it's so that residents, businesses, communities can look at their land, their sites, their usage, and look at, is that an opportunity I could take forward and look at it themselves. So that's something that is very new. I think that's only just, it's in the process of going on the website, or if it's just gone on the website. It's not on yet. So yeah, it will be on very shortly. So there you go, some breaking news on that one. But that is there really to do exactly what you've just said, to support and encourage residents to be able to look at that on bigger scales as well.
And the other thing, obviously, is that there's to an extent there are constraints over the grid and grid connection and what can be achieved there, which is not within our gift particularly. So there's what we can control, what we are in charge of, what we're not. But you say we might want to be supportive of, or whatever. Another element is storage. That's becoming quite a thing. Battery storage, which will be used to balance the grid. But again, we'd have to make decisions about where do we think is the appropriate location for those sorts of developments.
I'm going to move on to the county-wide issues now. But just before I do, I want to capture an action point and just confirm that you're happy with it, Councillor Swinglehurst, and I will leave it to the officers and yourself whether you do it or not. I think there should be an action point to capture a cost-benefit analysis of the net zero work that we're doing within the council. I'll tell you why. There's still a lot of scepticism out there about how much does this cost and are we paying taxes for it and everything else. I'm not asking for a lot of work. That's why I'm going to make it an action point. But I think you've still got some way to go, Ben and Garth, in actually selling net zero to everyone out there as worthwhile to them. And that debate we just had where you said there's more benefits than costs here. I really do think that needs to be promoted somewhere. So even within the carbon management plan, a short section on a cost-benefit analysis, just to make the point, this is not adding to your taxpayers' burden. In some respects, this might actually be saving you money. Councillor Swinglehurst?
Yeah, I think that's such a really good point, and it's one of the kind of great ironies, really, that people resist this sort of greening the economy because they see it as being expensive. But in fact, it's also what I call it meaning the economy. It's actually you can, what my mother used to call make, do, and mend, and being careful husbanding resources, including energy. Which is, as householders, we should all know that. What does it cost to turn off a light switch? What is your actual cost? Zero cost. What will it save you? Ooh, money. So, here's a thought. Why doesn't everyone turn off lights when they're not in a room? We have to husband our resources. So there's basically basic concept of it, you know, thinking it all the way through to when you're talking about large scale actions, the same logic really does apply. And the final thought here is that we cannot afford not to do it.
But oh yes, Ben, do you want to just finish this? Yes.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to say that in addition to that, we have got a really successful track record of pulling in external grants into the county to fund a lot of this activity. So we've currently got I know we're going to touch on county-wide shortly, but you know, we pulled in grants for business energy efficiency to support businesses to undertake free audits and to have capital grants of 50% towards energy efficiency and renewable energy measures. So we've been doing that for well over 10 years, and we've been pulling in millions on that. We've currently got probably 1.5 million for electric vehicle charge point infrastructure over the next year and a half, 2 years. We've got about £7 million of grants to help individual homeowners with energy efficiency measures in the home. And so a lot of that's all external money that the council isn't putting in, but is leveraged in and secured from external. So again, it is, you know, helping people through that.
We'll have a funding section in the CMP telling people that, because that's the point. I mean, let's be proud and positive about this. Can we move on to the county-wide emissions? Because I'm conscious of the time as well. Gareth, is that chart there, the one where we have quite a disturbing trend where we might not reach net zero until 2050? Do you want to talk us through the challenges with the county-wide sort of ambition? And then perhaps we can have a discussion, Councillor Swinghurst, about the role of the Herefordshire Climate and Nature Partnership Board and what, if anything, it's doing and what it might do more of, or what we might help it to do more of. But Gareth, over to you, just to give a picture over why that is looking like that at the moment and where the areas are that you have concerns about.
Certainly. It's somewhat heartening to see a consistent downward trend, other than the spike in the year 2020, which was, for obvious reasons, is a bit of an outlier when it comes to energy and emissions data. One thing we have in Herefordshire, the agricultural emissions, because that includes livestock, that hasn't been able to change much. For example, over 20 years, all the cars we buy have become more efficient without us really trying. Livestock hasn't really changed in the last 20 years. So that tends to form a levelling effect on the emissions, that those don't change. Obviously, the UK electricity generation and transmission system has changed a lot in the last 20 years, with the renewables coming online and the coal disappearing offline. So that has a huge impact. Other things like the county, the land use, the county isn't any bigger than it used to be. So those are factors which are difficult to change. And I think in a rural authority, those are significant parts of our challenge. We have touched on the cost. We have talked about the challenge of, for example, the residents, the people in the county, being able to change from petrol or diesel cars to electric vehicles. There's an ongoing cost there. There's the ability for people who might want to change. Can they charge those vehicles? Can they get the servicing, and can they get hold of those vehicles? There are issues with having rural, dispersed and older housing stock, that we are on the bad side of average from the UK's point of view, because our housing stock is older. We don't necessarily benefit from some of the urban heat island effect, for example, so that can add to heating bills. And obviously a lot of properties not being on the gas main mean that people are reliant on things like oil, which is obviously a more highly polluting fuel than more densely urban areas, where there's more likely people will be using electric heating in flats and things like that. Smaller properties, lower energy per household. There are a range of challenges. I think our challenges are similar to other rural authorities, but they're challenges which pretty much every authority in the UK shares. particularly certainly rural authorities, other authorities that might be similar to Herefordshire. And to be honest, they are shared. Some of our challenges are shared. Certainly, my knowledge of countries in Europe trying to decarbonise, we have a lot of the same shared challenges as they do. If you go to France, there's old houses and livestock and resistance to wind farms and what have you. So we're not unique in facing these challenges. I think one of the big things that we do need to do more work on, I think, is, as Councillor Stark has said, is selling it, is bringing people with us. I think I've been working in climate change for long enough to have seen the sort of outright denial has sort of disappeared, but now we are into very difficult conversations about what is the acceptable cost. And that acceptable cost is in terms of how much it costs us in monetary terms and how much it might cost us in terms of landscape change or loss of heritage assets or whatever it might be. And I think it's a bigger conversation than this council alone. It's a challenge for societies in developed countries across the world of how quickly and how fast are our citizens and our governance systems able to make this transition, as well as the sort of technological requirements that we need, because we can reach net zero. It's winning the hearts and minds and putting the financial and governance systems in place to make that happen, I think, are going to be really the biggest challenge.
I'll continue here because we'll come in, you come in, Councillor Thomas, because I'm going to be sweeping up quite a few of the sections here together to talk about the overall.
Yeah, we're talking about farming getting net zero. What's not taken in consideration, only just now starting to do scientific figures on it. Just a classic example. We grow in this county about 700,000 tonnes of grain. So that's equating to about 10 tonnes per hectare to 8.5 tonnes of dry matter. There is a huge amount of carbon in that dry matter, which until it gets into, unfortunately, in bread or whatever, into a human being, it gets released. But there is no thought at all, no figures. I've seen even NFU haven't produced no figures whatsoever, but they're there, which is pretty obvious. Now, if we go and take away a lovely field in Herefordshire, 10-acre field, and plant trees on it, it will be 50 years minimum before that forest, that wood, is produced, taking that much carbon out. It can then equate to what it did in agricultural production. And there's just no thought about this. And it extremely worries me. So if you look at the structure of agriculture in this county, we probably have a zero net carbon because of the amount that farming, agriculture is taken out. Take away the intensive livestock, that's a different kettle of fish. I'm just talking about ordinary agriculture. So, I don't see that anywhere.
Okay, before I bring officers in, are you saying, Councillor Thomas, we want to have some sort of recommendation around HCNP, it might not be officers here. I'm going to bring the board in shortly. About doing more work on what the impact of agriculture is on net zero. Yes. Councillor Highfield?
Yes, and to support what Councillor Thomas has said, and maybe to help you guys over there, you know, New Zealand was 25 years ago the poster boy for how green an environment they have. Now they're the bad boys because of all their sheep farting all the time. But they've just produced, their environment people have just produced a paper that claims that their sheep farming business is carbon neutral. Now, how valid that paper is, I don't know, but I think you should certainly look at it, because if they're actually telling the truth, that's a huge bonus for you. You'll be able to put your hands up in a couple of years and say, we've done it, you know. So I think that needs to be looked at, that paper. That was supposedly a scientific study. You can find it online, and if you can't find it, I've got a link to it somewhere. So that was just a suggestion to support what Councillor Thomas has said.
Yeah, I've captured
I think, Mr. Chairman, we just need, as you, I totally agree. I think we need to look at this a little bit more
Okay,
scientifically, and I think there should be a recommendation.
I've got
I'm not
one, and then we've got
answering
one to
anything,
come
but-
from you, and I've got 3 or 4. We're getting to the limit of our recommendations here. Otherwise, we'll be blowing our net zero ambitions on recommendations apart. Let's sweep up a number of the sections here in the plan, because I think we have to. I want to look at the sources of emissions for the county, which is that pie chart there. But I want to also draw in the role of the Herefordshire Climate and Nature Partnership Board here, Council Swinghouse, which you sit on, what we can do as a council member with that board to try and help to actually re-establish the line downwards for net zero ambition by 2030. I don't know, Gareth, if you've got any thoughts on how we could persuade the board to change that trajectory that you had on that page back to what it was, and where that would come from in terms of the pie chart sources that are shown. Or do you want to come in, Ben, here?
I don't think you'd need any persuading for them
Yeah,
to want
that should
the
be
graph to go down. You've got an excellent group there of representatives from across different sectors. As I said previously, we've got people from businesses, from agriculture, from higher education, big community groups, all sorts really, and it's really good to see that mix. And so what that group is doing at the moment is really looking at splitting into a number of themed actions and developing plans within that, and then within those plans as priority actions, because we're trying to bring together a high level matrix of, what are the big impactful, I suppose it's a 6x3, isn't it, essentially, of 18 actions from the 16 groups as priority actions to do over the next 12 months. So that's being, it's coming, it's almost finalised now, isn't it? And that'll be going up on the website shortly. In terms, I suppose it's the question really around how this committee can support that group. Is that really your question?
Yeah, well, my point is we have this trajectory that you've shown us, which is very worrying. We have the sources of the emissions. We have the board, it does exist. We have the council supporting the board. We have our deputy leader, who obviously has more than one commitment here, who's actually sits on the board. And I really want to get an idea from you for this committee, what we are doing to try and get that trajectory back to what our ambitions were. Councillor Swinghurst.
Thank you. I mean, I'm completely in agreement with Ben here that, there is nobody on that board who isn't passionate, and I have to say they are very, they marry that passion with knowledge, very deep knowledge and fabulous skill set, but they're not in control of everything that goes on in the county any more than we are. So they are a trigger point. They can share good practice, proselytise, get it out into the wider world, and support good behaviour. So we were talking about agriculture, which is a really complex area. And one of the things that came out of the board were farm carbon audits. So looking exactly at the point that Councillor Thomas is making. And that's revealed that, in a number of cases where you have particularly traditional farming, so a bit of arable, a bit of livestock, that's carbon neutral, or even in cases negative. And that work is important because it will trigger more farms to say, oh, well, I want one. I want to see what that's about. And then we've got some where it's nearly but not quite, and the farm's like, well, I want to get my farm, to net zero. How do I do that? And we can give them advice, and they can achieve that. So a lot of the partners on the board are doing work within their own organisation. So it might be the Wildlife Trust, and indeed a lot of the nature recovery work, because don't forget it's the climate and nature. So the nature recovery work will also benefit the climate, because we're talking about healthy soils, for instance. We're great for carbon sequestration, and so it all links together. It is fabulously complicated. It's very hard to get a kind of matrix to say this is therefore producing that. It's a little bit like the Nutrient Management Board in a sense that everyone's there. Their individual organisations are doing things. You have to kind of collate that, but also actually what that is creating the ripple effect to bring about positive change. So the board itself isn't going to do this, but it will be part of the starting that ripple out, whether it's in agriculture or transport or house building. There's a lot of attention there on retrofit, but also on building good low carbon houses and so forth, and making sure that people have that knowledge and that skill set, that we have a good pipeline. It's that sort of work.
We have a net zero ambition for the county. What I'm finding difficulty from this appendix, who actually owns that net zero ambition and who's going to be held accountable if we don't meet it.
This goes back to what you said before about making it front and centre
Yep.
in all our decisions.
One thing I'm thinking about that we can do as a council, which is positive, is reinvigorate the message here by showing our commitment. And I've got a recommendation down that the executive should restate its commitment clearly to the net zero ambition, not just for the council's own delivery and functions, but for the county-wide net zero ambition as well. It still leaves a gap there about how do we get ownership of net zero across the county accepted. Because you've told me, and I go back to that trajectory, that we're on a trajectory to 2050. We're going to miss our ambition by 20 years. What can we do to change that? With the instruments we've got, with the levers we've got, with the partnership board, what can we do that you could take forward from this day on? That's what I'm trying to get at. That restatement of commitment is one thing. The council can say, we believe in these net zero ambitions. We want to achieve that, because it's gone quiet in a way. I mean, when you go out there as a councillor and you talk about the issues that are at the forefront of people's minds, net zero isn't necessarily one anymore. And I do feel that if we are committed to a county-wide net zero by 2030, then somehow we've got to have a way of actually engaging people in that and starting to make it more of a reality than it is now. Gareth.
Yeah, it's something I think council officers in my position are struggling with up and down the country. That there is potentially a sense of inertia from a lot of people out there, the citizens going about their lives, that it's not necessarily a priority for them. I think as the council, we can use the council's powers. For example, we're, as Ben said, we're looking at rolling out the electric vehicle charge points. Now, we can't insist that citizens out there buy electric vehicles, but we can create a county in which electric vehicle ownership is an option. That's what we can do. We can't force people to get out of their car and walk or cycle, but we can create safe and useful walking and cycling routes to allow people to make those decisions. I think a lot of this net zero conversation will talk about things like people's personal freedoms, our freedoms that we're used to buy whichever car we like and drive it as much as we like. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the criticisms of net zero talk about that freedoms being impinged, but I don't see that necessarily as being the issue. But ultimately people are free to choose how they drive, and we as the council can't necessarily influence that. People are free for their dietary choices, which obviously has an impact on the agricultural systems, and particularly a lot of our food emissions are because we choose to eat exotic foods that we can't grow in the UK, like tea and coffee and rice and bananas, which most people don't think of as exotic anymore, but we can't grow them in the UK, so we import them. Obviously, there are things that we can do to create a culture where people feel that it's affordable for them to apply for planning permission to put solar panels on their building, or they have the ability to retrofit their houses and make them more energy efficient. The council can, of course, through its regulatory powers, through planning and building regulations and what have you, make that as simple, as straightforward and as painless for people to do as possible. And we can support them with grant aid, but of course we can't force somebody to choose to do that with their property. We still, I think, as a whole society, and the council is part of that, still need to do work on winning the hearts and minds, because I think we need to provide a better vision for what net zero actually looks like, and the benefits and the securities, the sort of security from flooding and price shocks and things like that, that net zero actually brings. I think it's very easy to look at the negatives, like a wind turbine in the landscape, for example. We need to do a better job for people like myself at getting out there and selling what the benefits, what the positives of net zero are, so that we can bring people with us, because we entirely rely on people buying in and being willing to join us on the net zero journey.
Before, I mean, I don't know if Ben wants to come in, but I want to bring in Councillor Pebbody, because you've got your virtual hand up, and I'm conscious that you've been listening very carefully to the rest of us. Justine.
Yeah, and there's this theme keeps emerging about bringing people with us, and I think what needs to happen, because it's true, there's a lot of scepticism about the value of net zero, and we need to create proximity to the problem, which is quite difficult in Herefordshire because we're not as affected as other areas. And I think the council is doing some really good work, and I've benefited from that myself. My organisation is one of the 30 businesses that signed up to the 30 for 2030 commitment. So I think the council is recognising that their part is 1%, but I can see a lot of work that's happening to bring people along and to reduce that scepticism and create this motivation and keep people engaged. So I agree with Louis that sometimes just restating our purpose, it creates a moment of symbolism that that brings people with us and also makes them realise that we are affected by it. It's so easy. It's not proximate enough to us. It's too distant, and I think that's where the scepticism comes from and the disengagement from it. So I think there's a lot of value in just restating our aims. I know it's just symbolic, but it could be as symbolic as Rosa Parks sitting on a seat on a bus. You know, it can have that kind of effect.
Thanks, Justine. I'm still struggling with this ownership issue. Who's going to drive this forward county-wide? We have this board, and we had the NMB as well, and I'm beginning to think we've got the same issues with this board as we had with the NMB, that they can advise and encourage, but they cannot get people to do. Why then did we sign up to a net zero ambition for the county for 2030 if, as it looks like from this trajectory, we're going to miss it by years? That's my problem. And is there anything we can do to turn this juggernaut round? Or do we have to actually look again at what the net zero ambition that we can have for the county that is realistic?
So for start, it was the full council that signed up to this and then reaffirmed that in the vote last year. So we've already kind of, okay, just keeping on reaffirming it. I think it just slightly gets a bit repetitive. I always think that a target is only a target. We should stretch, we should strive, we should try our best to get to net zero 2030. What's the worst that can happen? We won't get there, but we'll have a damn good try. Rather than say before you've even started, well, we won't get there, so we won't bother. So I think, let's not be afraid to fail, but let's try not to. Let's do our utmost to succeed. I don't see what the harm is in that. What's the worst that can happen is that you'll get most of the way there, some of the way there. You'll have made some improvement. You'll do your utmost. But we're not in control of everything. But actually, there are things that we're not in control of that will happen anyway. EVs will become more common. It's inevitable. Yeah. People will put more and more air source heat pumps, and they will make their houses more efficient. It's inevitable. A lot of this is inevitable. It's not in our control. We neither can take blame nor praise for it. These are bigger things that are happening around us. But I think we shouldn't be afraid to set an ambitious target.
I mean, I'm not against that, but I'm still looking at this trajectory at the moment and still trying to get to grips with with that. Councillor Davis and then Councillor Highfield.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to have some understanding of where we actually stand at the moment compared to other counties. I mean, other rural counties that are trying to achieve the same objectives that we are. Do we have any capability, or are we benchmarking at the moment against others? How are we doing?
I think it is complex because every county and every council is different. I've had a look around at some other figures. Obviously, Herefordshire is a unitary authority. If you look at, I did look at some of the neighbours, for example, Gloucestershire, where the county's figures are a lot lower because they have district councils. Those district councils are obviously taking some of the functions. I think there's quite a lot of complexity into trying to create that benchmarking because all of the authorities are different. I think anecdotally, my impression from being at the authority for a year and a half is that the authority has moved on, progressed further than the authorities in Wales that I previously had experience of working with. But I'm sure that there are other authorities perhaps further ahead and further behind. I think that the benchmarking, there is an effort in the local government circles to benchmark, but unfortunately, because of all the differences in the way that we record our carbon emissions, it's very difficult to be comparable. So, for example, some include their schools, or some don't include some of their contracted services, because it's left very much up to them to decide what to include and what to not include. So I have had a look at it, and it isn't a simple answer. I think some of the county figures are quite useful in terms of per capita per square kilometre. Those can give you an idea, but of course we're going to be vastly different than an authority in centre of Birmingham or centre of London, or indeed the north of Scotland. So.
Yes, first comment, I very rarely disagree with Ms. Swinglehurst, but I only succeeded in giving up smoking 30 odd years ago because I refused to accept the possibility of failure. So I don't think we should acknowledge the possibility that we're going to fail on this. But there are some concrete things that planning is a big thing if we're going to actually get closer to 2030 than 2050. For example, just recently, a large solar farms planning application was turned down because a lot of the public didn't like it because they could see it from miles away. And likewise, we don't allow, at the moment, solar panels on listed buildings. And I think it's about time we recognise we're in a climate emergency, and some sacrifices, cost-free sacrifices, but environmental sacrifices need to be made. And after all, solar panels on a listed building won't alter the building. It might make it look a little less attractive, but it's going to alter the structure or damage the structure of the building. So there's opportunities within current planning to improve the amount, to actually do things which we're not doing now, and they're cost-free. So we should look at that.
We'll think about that maybe as an action point, or a recommendation. Councillor Peverty, you've got your virtual hand up again.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of marketing side to look at as well, which again, going back to this winning hearts and minds and bringing everyone along with us. And that's what I meant by kind of reaffirming our commitment, which I think most people are really proud that the fact that Herefordshire has made a more ambitious target for itself. I think that's a source of pride for a lot of people. So the reaffirmation of that is in that every time we talk about any policy decision, if our net zero ambition is embedded in that decision, then it needs to be kind of branded and say, this is why we're doing it, because we are working towards this achievement. And I think it comes back to a conversation that we had earlier, that, are we really talking about this? Is it really embedded? Are we really recognising it? I just think there might be more work to do on the kind of marketing side, which will bring people along with us, which is what half the battle is, given that the council is just 1% of the county ambition.
So that's 2 action points for the council, not recommendations. One is to look at whether we can do more under the planning regulations to encourage renewable energy sources. That's an action point. I'm being very good. I'm trying to avoid recommendations today because I'm concerned about your capacity here. And I'll just let Daniel capture that. And the second action point, on top of, Justine, the recommendation that I'm staying with, that the executive should restate their commitment to it, is that we should do more on the communication stroke marketing side to promote the benefits of net zero across the county as a council. At this stage, we might have more action points and recommendations. That'll be a first.
Just to comment on Councillor Highfield's comment about listed buildings. I recently moved into a listed building, had the listed building officer along with brilliant recommendations about how we can retrofit a listed building. So she explained that we may not be able to put solar panels on our roof, but they're now developing, for example, tiles that are actually solar panels. So the building will look the same, but will have solar panels on it. So I think there's quite a lot of experience and information within that department already about retrofitting listed buildings.
Right. I'm going to finish off soon by looking at the factors outside our control and what we can do about that, if any, because we haven't really touched upon that. Particularly nationally, what we might do as a council in terms of perhaps engaging with ministers, in fact, engaging with the new government, because we have an election and that's a potential opportunity for us. I have one specific issue, and this is the position of academies. I noticed in the appendix it wasn't clear who would be driving forward net zero with the academies across the county. They sit outside what we used to know as a local education authority now, but I didn't see any real sort of evidence that the Herefordshire Climate and Nature Partnership Board were taking ownership of it as well. It's a very specific point, and I've got a recommendation at the moment, but it just seems to me that if we're looking at schools, particularly children, getting the message across that it's their future, this is what we're doing it for, that just seems an oddity that where we've got thousands of children at schools, we don't seem to have any clear picture of who is actually engaging with academies on net zero. Can I have a comment, please? Although there's a recommendation there already that I've drafted.
Yeah, the academies are not included within the sort of council sphere of influence in terms of the carbon emissions. That's really a function of the greenhouse gas protocol kind of explains what we should include and what we shouldn't include, because it avoids organisations cherry picking, effectively choosing what to include and what to exclude. Because the academies are free to choose and sort of govern themselves, our capacity is limited. I do know, for example, that the academy trusts that are linked to the Church of England, the Church of England produces its own greenhouse gas report for its operations, and it has an estimate for its academy trust schools within that. So certainly obviously that's a very large organisation that has some power to influence what its academy trusts do. The more independent ones, I would imagine it's whether it's a conversation they're having or whether it's something they may look back to the council for some guidance or look to the Department of Education. I'm unsure at the moment, but it is something that could be examined, I guess.
Yeah,
so.
Really interesting to have a conversation.
Digging on this, Chair.
Pardon?
Just a little bit digging on this.
I'm just having a chat with the scrutiny officer we have a number of issues with schools and academies, particularly the school run, which has a huge impact on transport emissions. And I see, and particularly when it comes to secondary schools being further apart, and there's more travel, and you're looking at travel plans. They're much bigger schools as well, and they must have a huge impact on what their youngsters think about in terms of net zero and the climate change. And I can't see anything in the appendix which gives a clear lead for anyone to engage with them. I don't think it's the council, because I think they are at arm's length. But my recommendation at the moment points the finger at the partnership board. Now, I know it's also the DFE, but the partnership board could then engage with the DFE. But there's two things here. There's the impact of their activities on CO2 itself, because of all the travel and everything else that they might do with their buildings. But there's the impact on what they might do in terms of selling the message to the children, who can then sell it to their parents, who they then can hopefully be encouraged, whether they're business people, whether they're individuals, to actually help in the net zero sort of ambitions we have. It just seems to me a huge void at the moment, and I just didn't get anything from it in the appendix. Ben?
So I suppose a number of things in there, and I agree with you. I think through the carbon management plan period, we've had a number of really successful schools, environmental and energy programs supported schools. So we've had dedicated staff for a number of years in the past. We haven't got a program at the moment where we've had a dedicated officer who Jane would go into probably 30 schools plus each year, work with them on energy efficiency audits, looking what's possible, helping them to go for grants, helping them to access. There's a Salix fund where schools can get 0% interest loans to invest in those type of measures. So we did energy audits at, I think, every school that wanted to work with us on that. And we were doing assemblies in schools. We were really promoting the eco school programs. At the moment, we've got, as part of the climate assembly work, we've got a dedicated school travel plans officer that's going into all schools, and that would include academies in the same way, looking at how we support them with their travel plans, how we look at the behaviour change, and reducing the carbon there. So I suppose we haven't got a buildings aspect at the moment, but we have got a transport one. And we do find that over time, you work with a number of schools, and then you don't always get the same level of sustained interest, I guess, and engagement. So it's kind of, we've developed the programs differently. So we have got a history of working quite closely with schools on that. At the moment, the focus is on transport. We also do a lot with bikeability and a lot on going into schools and getting, I suppose, that behaviour change, walking, cycling, active travel modes as well, supported with safe routes to school. But I think your comment and suggestion potential action point for us to take then is to suggest that the Climate Nature Board have explore avenues to engage with academy trusts in a different way, to make that contact. And I think a consistent message and recommendation today has been around increasing comms and that reach and sharing best practice, and that's heard very clearly. And I think again it's that opportunity there to engage with the residents of tomorrow, isn't it really, and an early stage to get those behaviours in. So yeah, I think that'd be a very positive action note that we'll take away, irrespective of if it's an action note, if that's okay.
Well, we'll look at the recommendation, but we can see that HCMP should engage with the impact these academies have, and also to encourage them to get school children on side as well. But I just felt it was such a big gap there, and I understand you're doing a lot of individual work, but it wasn't clear in the appendix who was driving that forward. Ben, do you want to say something else?
Yeah, sorry, just one other one to add. As part of the Climate Nature Board as well, when we initially set it up, we did have representation from the Youth Council, particularly trying to engage with younger residents as well, and we're looking at better ways to do that, to increase that reach, as you're describing with young residents. So that is something the board is actually grasping with, how we can better do that, and working with the current Youth Council on that as well.
My net zero ambition is to finish at 4, then we will have a break. while we gather the recommendations. I'm determined not to fail, but I do want to spend the last 20 minutes on factors outside of the council control, which is quite an important one. We might not be able to do anything with it, but I just want us to finish off the discussion because I think it completes the actual debate on net zero, just to see where we are. Now, on the national infrastructure limitations with the national grid, which I think it's called national grid now, even in Herefordshire now. What we're doing as a council to engage with them to try and perhaps get them to actually buy into our net zero ambitions county-wide. Ben?
So you're talking really around the grid infrastructure and how we're working with, yes.
We're
Yes, so-
spelling out what our ambitions are and what can they do about it. And it's all very well saying there's a problem here, but I don't want it just to be left like that. I want to engage with them and see what, if anything, is actually possible.
Absolutely. So Richard Vaughan should have given apologies for this morning. Actually, our sustainability and climate change manager, he's away on holiday this week, so he couldn't make it. But himself and the team do work very closely with I've forgotten the National Grid or WPD. I can't remember what they've renamed themselves. NGET, that's it. So they have their Rio Ed programs, which is their forward investment programs, and so they're looking at, okay, what is the grid infrastructure, where are they going to put investment, and they're asking for, you know, what is the strategic development, what are the ambitions going forward, so they know where to put that investment to build the business case for that. So the team have very actively been engaging in those programs and consultations to try and help shape, you know, in terms of our aspirations for decarbonisation of transport and that shift to electrification of vehicles and what that means, and also looking at, again, that kind of high level renewable energy opportunity mapping, looking at where can that be, how do we support more microgen across buildings, as well as that investment in larger sites, and looking at how we can unlock capacity within the existing grid, because there's one thing to look at. You're right, you know, there's big constraints in the national grid in Herefordshire, and so what we're looking at is, through their forward investment programs, how we can influence them and give them, you know, that strategic vision for Herefordshire that helps them to do that. But equally, again, through the Climate Nature Board, one of the projects that, again, the LEP supported with, I can't remember what exactly they're called, but they were putting some small devices across the grid at different meter exchange points that really give much better accuracy of monitoring the demand management and the in and out of renewable energy, because the grid can only facilitate so much renewable energy going in, and so what they've got to be precautionary on that approach. And so by investing in better monitoring, they've been able to unlock and enable more connections from renewables without investing in the grid, through creating a smarter network that has better intelligence of what's in there. So again, that's been a project that the members of the Climate Nature Board have been working on. And energy is one of the subgroups specifically and priority areas of the board, because it is such a big issue, and they do, as I say, work very closely with the distributors.
I mean, they also talk about gas, water and rail. Now, I've seen all the work on Midland Connect and the work they're doing in terms of trying to improve the rail infrastructure, but they never mention net zero in these discussions. Welsh Water, we talk about pollution, we talk about phosphate stripping, we talk about wetlands, never talk about net zero. And gas, I don't know where we are with that. It just seems to me that you've drawn an issue out here, but I'd like to know what you plan to do about it, or what the partnership board might plan to do about it. That's what I'm really asking as a committee, for some feedback on that. Gareth?
I can certainly add something from that. Topical from a meeting I had this week as part of the Marches Forward partnership. The Welsh partners, Monmouthshire and Powys, are in the process of producing what's termed local area energy plans. Now, these are every authority in Wales either has or is in the final stage of producing their local area energy plans. And this is exactly to kind of future cast this idea of what will our energy system look like to be net zero in 2030. How much electricity will we be using, where will it be, and looking at things like how much will hydrogen be significant in terms of a vehicle fuel? And if it is, where do we store it? Where do we produce it? So they're beginning to look at these in a high level sense. Energy data is very clear in terms of our baseline, because of course all of us have an electricity or gas meter in our homes. There is a company that takes great interest in gathering that data accurately. So we do have good indications of how much energy we use. We can futurecast and have a look at how much energy might we use. For example, if we install 1,000 heat pumps a year and we replace gas, we can model how that energy demand will change. The same with as our vehicles get older and the more polluting vehicles are replaced, or petrol and diesel are replaced with EVs. We can guess, but we can model that with some certainty, and take that data back to the energy system operators, the National Grid Energy Distribution, and give them that information. I've working for this years ago where they weren't that engaged, I have to say, but the energy system operators have become much more engaged, because a lot of their work is in fact dictated by Ofgem. They can only spend time doing things that Ofgem approves, and Ofgem is now very keen that the network operators engage better with councils. The model that has been trialled in Wales is now being championed, I think, from benefit for the network operator to work a lot closer with councils. They used to be quite separate. Councils do your thing, we will do our thing. But I think they've realised that desperately needed to be joined up, and it's very clear that we're in the early stages of that happening at a high level through Ofgem, and down at a local level just over the border, and we hope there's opportunities for us to learn from that, and take some of that learning away. And the network operators are now a lot more eager to listen, I think, to the future system that we might have, or the council might be minded to model, and we can hopefully fill that gap, because before it has been quite reactive, and not that well planned.
I still think it's worth capturing an action point. See, I'm really into action points today. I really am. I mean, I'm getting soft as chair. I'll be getting deselected at this rate. I better watch it, because. But I think the action point should be for all utility companies and the rail network. I'm not saying there isn't work going on there, Gareth. I'm not saying there aren't opportunities, you say, to pick up good practice elsewhere. But I'm very conscious this is another area where we have discussions within the council, where we look at our relationship with them in terms of specific issues, and we don't take the same opportunity to actually raise with them our net zero ambitions. So I think an action point for that, Clark, will simply be to ask the executive to engage more proactively with utility companies and rail and network rail and railway companies, I don't mind how we phrase it, to promote our net zero ambitions across the county. Because you gave me the problem, and I want to help as a committee with some sort of idea of how we might move forward on it. Gareth?
I'll just add, I think it's the net zero ambitions are now shared by those bodies as well, the rail operators, the network operators. The issue has been they tend to be quite top down, and because we're local, we tend to be quite bottom up. And I think it's now finding where we fit together, and that in the last few years has definitely moved forward more than it has previously. I think due to government pushing, Ofgem pushing the general direction of travel, we've realised that is a significant issue, and I think everybody is on the same page about wanting to solve it, and it's just a question of working through what the best way to fit the top down and the bottom up will be in practice.
It's a slight digression here, but we do have national highways as well. Do we engage with them as well?
Yes, it's unfortunate Mark had to leave, because he could probably give you a lot of detail on that. So obviously, as part of the the local transport plan and all the work the team are doing there, they are very active with Highways England, National Highways and DFT.
So we would pick that up in our local plan or local transport plan. So the fact we've got a recommendation up, we don't need another one. That then brings me on to financing here. The actual view here is very much national funding, and how do we get government to actually help us to move towards our net zero ambitions. Ben, you already said we do get quite a lot of funding. What I did have, but I've actually removed, were 2 recommendations on the capital programme and our own revenue budget, and whether when we look at those, we take into account our net zero ambitions in doing so. I have removed them because they're already gone for the year. But what's your view as officers as to whether we give enough attention to what we're trying to do in terms of net zero when it comes to the capital programme and our revenue budget setting?
I suppose revenue and capital, I mean, in terms of take capital first, because that's the larger amount, I mean, we've had tremendous success as a council investing through the capital programme in energy efficiency measures. So, I mean, several years ago, we were the first authority, I think, in the country to fully convert to LED street lighting. I think we spent something like £10 million on that programme in total, and that was a carbon initiative. That wasn't, you know, that came through the carbon management plan. We looked at where our biggest areas of emissions were. That was one of them. So we did some trials, we rolled that out, and that is one of those examples where I said we've really reaped the benefits and financial savings there, because we were looking at well over £500,000 a year on energy costs, probably over 10 years ago, and now it's circa 200 grand with compound interest on that. So, you know, that is a huge saving, and that's from direct investment of the council's own, you know, using the Public Works Loan Board to do that through the capital programme. We've also invested in loads of other energy efficiency programmes. So the lighting in here, we did invest to save lighting across all of our buildings. What we also do is supplement that a lot with a lot of external grants. So we've been the team are very, very good at going for those grants and looking at the horizon there. In terms of the revenue budget, yeah, we do have a really well-established team in Herefordshire that look at sustainability and climate change. So I think we are well resourced in that respect, and also it's then looking across other services and other activities that we do. I meant to say earlier, really, when you were talking around benchmarking, you know, I'm really proud to say that the team that we take part in benchmarking every year, and for the last 3 years, Herefordshire has come out top in the West Midlands on sustainability benchmarking. Really, in terms of all the interventions across climate, nature, and sort of climate adaptation, economic, like that shift to low carbon economy as well. So, I mean, I can share some more of that if you're interested in there. But we do look across other authorities, and actually the council is well resourced in that respect.
That's great, and it's very much Pacific driven in terms of the projects. But have you looked at the capital programme this year in terms of net zero impact overall? Because I do have a recommendation around the new road strategy. Not about the merits or otherwise of it. That's a huge project that we're going to embark on. It's got huge implications for embedded carbon, huge implications for perhaps cutting down trees and replacing, as you said, Councillor Thomas, grassland, which could be very good for sequestering carbon. So while you've talked about Pacifics there, what I really meant, has anyone looked at the overall impact of what our decision was on the capital programme as a whole, or the revenue budget? I accept that we have to put so much into the 2 statutory areas, but it just seems to me that you could be winning on one hand, and then we could be taking decisions that's taken away with another. I don't know if anyone's made that assessment, or even whether the Cabinet thought about it when they were putting together the capital programme. Councillor Swingoss, what the overall impact of it was.
There's a couple of things in there. So, again, one of the recommendations from the previous climate scrutiny group was really that putting more in carbon consideration into business cases for the capital programme. So anything that goes through the capital programme would have that environmental consideration as part of its business case. So everything in the capital programme should have gone through that process already. I don't have to hand, but we could probably pull together a list of all the cumulative impact of the capital programme, because as I said, they're all being considered individually. We do annually look at the capital programme and say what percentage of that capital programme is investing in low carbon and sustainability projects. So every year we do look at that. I don't think we've updated that just yet. I mean, the capital programme is still fairly new, but I can do that again and show, you know, of the capital programme over the last how many years, what percentage of it is being spent in this type of investment. So I don't know if that helps.
Another action point. Yes. Which is just to reflect what you said, Ben, which is for the executive to ask for a net zero assessment of the 24/5 capital programme. Nice and simple, and we'll leave it to executive and officers to decide how they take that forward. Councillor Highfield, you did want to bring in an issue about buying land and the tree
Yeah, is it
strategy.
appropriate for this point
That
here?
will be the very last point
Okay.
before we actually come to a break.
I don't want to upset Councillor Thomas about valuable farming land, and it is valuable. However, going forward, there is going to be a need for this sequestration to be improved. In other words, not just what we've got now, but we're going to have to try to help us meet our targets to increase the amount of sequestration. And when a developer, for example, needs to be carbon neutral, how do they achieve that? And we can help and possibly even make a little bit of money out of it. What we should do when the opportunity arises is to buy any unproductive land that's for sale. And it doesn't have to be in the county. Because when a developer says, I want to build 200 houses and everything else is okay, but how are you going to meet your carbon neutral? Well, we happen to have a few fields that we could lease to you or sell to you that you could fill with trees, and that would meet your requirements. Or maybe we've got a wildlife corridor that needs developing. The farmer's with it, but he can't afford to put the trees and the new hedges in and so on. He'll get his subsidy under the new agricultural thing, but you need to put in all that stuff to make the wildlife corridor. Those are opportunities that we should seize, I believe. And that might be a recommendation, not a...
Do you want it as a recommendation then?
Well, let's see what Ben's going to say about it first, and then if he's not strongly averse, then we can put it.
I suppose just to assure you really on the kind of thinking that you're describing there. So some work that's already underway. I sort of alluded to it earlier with the local nature recovery network and the mapping there. That's very much looking across the county, looking at wildlife sites, looking at wildlife corridors, and sort of bringing that together to then develop a strategy, which will then help us with our sort of, I suppose, biodiversity net gain targets, but wider within that, because we are linking that very closely to sequestration and opportunities within that. So that's part of what we're looking at there. Another thing with biodiversity net gain, which is very similar to what you're saying, really, and that's kind of coming through legislatively much quicker, in that any new development now is going to have to demonstrate 10% biodiversity net gain. And in the same way as you're describing with carbon, some developers may not be able to do that on site, and so if they can't, they're going to have to do it off site, or they're going to have to pay for credits either through local schemes or national schemes. And so, you know, some of the thinking we've already got, and I know Councillor Swinghurst, you've been very, very keen on this, is looking at, you know, can we invest in the development of those biodiversity credits in a similar manner? So take, for example, one of the wetlands we've already developed at Luston. You know, that would have a significant number of biodiversity credits there because of the very nature of that site. You know, the wetlands there have huge biodiversity benefits, and so that could be an opportunity. And as such, we are looking at that, and the carbon side of it would be very closely aligned with it. So I just wanted to assure you we are looking at those sort of opportunities at the moment, but there is more to do.
Good, so we can probably I'll try and draft something.
I'm just going to suggest something which...
oh, no, okay.
Councillor Peverty wants to come in. We are going to be looking at the tree strategy and hedgerow management. And I just wonder, to give officers enough time to respond to what you've just said in terms of your request, because it will get captured in the minutes, won't it? That we return to that very point when we discuss tree management and hedgerow policy, because you should have time then, you or whoever else lives in that, to address that point and to see what you can recommend in terms of how that might be taken forward. And it's not just about the county land assets, it's about maybe buying land elsewhere as
And
well.
just to come
with,
in
with
there-
that view to making an income, but also meeting our net zero impact as well.
Just to come in there to help us with our policies, I'm trying to arrange now, in fact it will be arranged, for a professor, an ecology professor, to come to talk to the council and the council officers about best practice in hedgerow and verge management. Because we need to be a bit more ambitious than the current national guidelines on this. And we can be, provided it's not mandatory. So in other words, we'd try to get a voluntary code that goes further than the national things, based on a scientific approach to what is best practice in hedge management. So that would help formulate this. And, you know, creating better hedgerows costs money. If a farmer's very keen to have a wildlife corridor on his land, but it costs. He may get a subsidy later when it's all done, but to get it going, so there's our opportunity for developers to fund that, and we get it both ways, and acquiring land could be part of that. So yeah, hedgerow management is something we're going to talk later, are we, about public rights of way?
So we'll pick that up, because we are going to have that as part of our 24-25 programme. But we're just flagging it up now. That's why I asked Councillor Highfield to come in. That we will, it's an exam question that you're hearing about in advance, let's say that. Councillor Pebbody, you did have your hand up, and I do want to give you a chance to have the final say in whatever you want to, point you want to make.
I did have a point to make, but actually Ben covered it very much. The Country Land and Business Association are marketing to their members exactly that, the opportunities that there are to use their land for the benefit of developers who need to meet biodiversity net gain targets, and how it's an opportunity to raise some money.
Oh, okay, thank you. I'm really in a very generous mood today, because we're going to have a 20-minute break, partly because we've got quite a lot of action points I just want to actually confirm, and a number of recommendations I want to confirm. Ben and Gareth, I mean, you can leave now if you've got other things to do, because we're going to be looking at the work programme and the chairman's update after this, unless you want to come back after the break and hear our debate on the recommendations. But it'll be hopefully just voted through, I would hope, given that we've covered them quite largely in the debate itself. What I would like to say is that was really interesting, and can I thank everyone for sticking to the 2 hours. I really think we could have gone for 4 hours on this, because it's so massive, but we have to be disciplined. And of course we might come back to net zero too when you actually have your net carbon management plan in draft, and we can look at that as a scrutiny committee if you want. So thank you very much, everyone. We'll have a 20-minute break back here just after Welcome back to the Environment and Sustainability Committee meeting of the 27th of March. For those zooming in, the committee is now going to consider 4 recommendations to put to the executive on our net zero discussion today. The scrutiny officer will then read out 6 action points that we will in due course put to the lead member on the Cabinet on Environment, Councillor Swinglehurst, to take forward as she can. The 4 recommendations are on the screen. That Herefordshire Council, oh, there's too many that's in that first one.
Okay, noted.
That Herefordshire Council,
I think it needs an ensure in there.
ensure, yeah, we had ensure before. That Herefordshire Council ensure, it's just the ensure's got missing after Herefordshire Council.
Yeah, noted. I'll read that out again then. That Herefordshire Council ensure that the environmental impacts sections
Should be section, that's right.
of reports to Council and Cabinet include the net zero impact, both Council and county-wide, of the policy or service proposal. 2, that the Executive, in setting out its new road strategy, highlight what the impact will be on the net zero ambition for the county and how that might be mitigated. 3, that the Herefordshire Climate and Nature Board seeks school academy representation on its board. And 4, for the Executive to make the reduction and sequestration targets clearer in the carbon management plan.
And I think it should be the future carbon management plan, because it's going to be the next one that they actually draw up. They're not going to go back and revise this
Okay.
one.
For clarity again then, for the Executive to make the reduction and sequestration targets clearer in its future carbon management plan.
Right. First of all, can we vote? Are we happy to vote on it en bloc? All those in favour? All those in favour of the actual 4 recommendations? That is carried. Thank you very much. Thank you, Councillor Swinglehurst, for your help here. Now, Daniel, you're going to read the 6 action points. We will send them to you, Councillor Swinglehurst, once we've actually finalised them. But this is the gist of the 6 action points. Do you need to put them up on the screen?
No, it's okay, Chair. I'll read these out because these aren't as fully formed as the recommendations. Okay. The proposal is that we will send the following action points to the lead cabinet member in due course. They will be, roughly speaking, again, we'll clarify the exact wording of these and we'll post these into the minutes at the same time as we send them to the chair. So if you just agree the sort of general direction of them at this stage, I think that will do the job. So the action will be for the lead cabinet member to report on how the carbon management plan sets out the overall costs and benefits of net zero, the net zero impacts within the council's capital programme, identifying opportunities within planning policy to maximise the opportunities for renewable energy production, to ask the Herefordshire Climate and Nature Board to commission an evaluation of the true net zero impact of agriculture in the county, to engage more proactively with utility and rail companies that operate in Herefordshire, and to draft a communications plan to promote the need for and benefits of net zero to Herefordshire.
On the second last action plan, we're not just talking about utility companies, we're also talking about Network Rail as well.
Apologies if I didn't say that. I did. I've got noted down utility and rail companies.
Yeah, I've got that, yes, yeah. Okay. Do we have to vote on that?
Wouldn't hurt to.
All those in favour? That's carried. Thank you very much. That ends the substantive item on net zero. We now go on to the work programme, which we had a very useful discussion on a work programme for 24-25 yesterday, and I have briefed Councillor Highfield in private on what we discussed. We have 5 slots in each year for meetings for this particular committee, but traditionally in July it's normally been a non-public meeting where we confirmed our work programme for the year. We don't normally cover a topic at the July meeting. We could do, I mean, I'm quite open-minded about it. Also, as Daniel said, in looking at the 4 topics that we agreed we will take forward for 24-25, they will have to have discussions with officers to see what the timing of these particular topics might be in terms of papers they might be producing or initiatives they might be working on at the current time. But the 4 topics roughly in order that we would like them on the work programme are prowls and greenways. That's the first one. Tree and hedgerow strategy and management, second one. Energy efficiency and retrofitting, the third one. And the fourth one, assuming that we don't have 5 next year, gosh, I've just suddenly lost what it was. I'll come back to me.
20 mile speed limits, wasn't it? We were talking about yesterday.
No, it's not. It's active travel measures, including 20 miles. That's why I couldn't remember. I kept thinking, is it 20 mile per hour speed limits? No, it's active travel measures, including 20 mile per hour speed limits. Thank you for that nudge. I was going as slow as the 20 miles per hour there and trying to think it through. We have already discussed in the past the need to look at the river lug pollution issue specifically, because that raises a number of issues around what the sources of the pollution are, the impact it's having on development around there, the fact that we have invested in wetlands to try and offset that, what Welsh Water might be doing in terms of their own investment. That we decided should be wrapped up in an informal debate that we're going to have as a committee on farming, where we will draw out not just the actual river lug issue as a particular topic, but other issues that we want to take forward on farming. And we may find we might get 4 or 5 out of that one as well. So that's the picture that is emerging on the work programme. We don't need to sign off on that today, because one of the things we'll have to do is populate underneath those headlines specific objectives that we want to take forward on each of those topics, and that's something we'll need to work on. But I'm more than happy if committee members want to suggest objectives under each of those topics, just by email to Daniel, because Councillor Thomas.
Can I, well, I just, this river lug, there's a lot of planning tied up behind all this, and I'm just wondering if we ought to perhaps bring that one, if you want to combine it with that, bring it forward and earlier in the programme.
Well, sorry, yeah, Daniel.
Just a bit of clarity about how we're plotting the work programmes, not just for this committee, but for all of the committees. All 5 scrutiny committees have now carried out a review of their work in the previous year and started to draft long lists. I'll be taking this to a strategic meeting of directors and scrutiny chairs that we propose to hold in April, to try and make sure that those 5 work programmes knit together well, and that the scrutiny chairs are happy that they deliver an effective work programme, and that we work with directors and cabinet members so that they have sight on and we have a common agreement on that. What we'll then do very early May, just before our committee meeting, is it would be good to have a session again with the committee and with the relevant directors, not only to identify those objectives, but also the information that you're going to need and the training and the briefing that you would like to be able to come to a considered decision on some of these matters. So it would just be a good opportunity to plan that in a bit more detail before we finalise the work programme. Those 2 extra meetings also provide a good opportunity to identify the best time to look at these topics, and the directors in particular can be really useful in shaping that work programme for you, so you hit topics at the right time, so the relevant information is available for you. So it sounds a little convoluted, but by May we should have a work programme, a clear set of objectives, the training and briefing that you need to deliver there, and the commitment from the directors and from the portfolio holders to support that for the year ahead. So you should be, I mean, obviously you're in a very strong position now, because this committee has a very clear sense of where it wants to go and the topics it wants to look at, and it already has, by any measure, a plausible work programme. But I think if we build on this and use this next couple of months to do that, you can really hit the ground running come July, sorry.
that's been missing in all of this, which has been a favourite of mine when it comes to budget allocation. That's the resources allocated to the environmental side of the house in terms of the Economy and Environment Directorate. It is one that's been on our long list for quite a while. I don't think it would take up a whole session by itself, Daniel, but if we can just bear in mind that perhaps one of the topics we've already thought of, if it's slightly less intense or less wide in scope than some of the rest, I would like to think about also adding on to that particular agenda the resources allocated to the environment side of the house. Because without the officer time to do some of this work, I mean, we struggled for years to get ecologists, for example, then we can't do the planning that we want to do in terms of making sure that developments do conform to biodiversity net gain and everything else. We can't really have some of these plans drawn up in the way we would without having the staff to do the carbon management plan and everything else. And I've always been concerned over the years that the two statutory areas, when it's come to the crunch in terms of the impact on environment and economy, economy's taken it and environment has been the poorer cousin. But I need to test that. I could be wrong, but I need to test that. And I think that could be an additional item. So I'd like that to be brought into the equation, Daniel, but not as a topic in itself, a whole agenda, but to be added to one where we think we can actually look at it and give it justice. So it's possible we may have an agenda next year where we might have two topics for once, but that will be the exception rather than the rule, because my approach here, as you all know, is to give enough time to give a topic the intense debate and scrutiny that we need to give it, because otherwise scrutiny is just, it doesn't work when it's very shallow, because we don't add value then. And I think it did take us at least 2 hours to do net zero today, and that's my sort of barometer, is a topic for 2 hours is what I think it should be for every meeting. And I hope you agree. But that other one we may have as two topics, but it will be the exception rather than the rule. We don't need to vote on that. We just we just need. But are you content to move forward? And we will have as part of that series of meetings up to May, the one on farming, which we could talk about ourselves. We don't necessarily need input from anyone. We're just trying to break. We're trying to break the elephant down into manageable chunks. That's what it is. Councillor Highfield.
Yeah. I'm fully with you on this. It's just that during our so far 2 Rivers conferences, there's been a great deal of information about farming that's come out of that from speakers on both sides of the house, and some of that information is available and has been recorded, so we can use that as a foundation for a discussion on the subject. The Cabinet member knows all about that as well, and there's a great deal of useful information and some interesting conclusions that came out of it as well.
Well, if you want to share that with us in case we don't have links to it, then I'm happy for you to do so. Sure. Councillor Highfield.
Yeah.
Or you could do it.
All of the other committees, apart from this one, actually have meetings in May. I'm not suggesting you have a meeting in May, but what I'm suggesting is that a slot in May would be ideal for your farming conference indeed. So if we put that sometime around late May, after you've decided your work programmes, I can make that happen. Okay, great stuff.
I'm happy with that. And I'm delighted to see the work ethic of the other committees. You said that, Councillor Highfield. I couldn't possibly comment. At the last committee meeting, I took an action to bring to attention of the Democratic Services Manager the fact that we've only had responses on one set of recommendations since the inception of this committee in July 2022. We have at least 4 outstanding recommendations, sets of recommendations in train: waste and recycling. We've got the Nutrient Management Board, river pollution, and the Environment Act. I'm hoping, Councillor Swinglehurst, that Ben will actually be able to bring all of those forward to us in the near future. But if we are going to have a meeting in May, Daniel, that could be an opportune time as well to actually review the executive responses to those particular recommendations. Councillor Swinglehurst, have you got any update for us on those?
No, I don't. I'm really disappointed that you haven't had those responses. So let me check, see where they are on the pipeline, and give them a nudge.
Because if we can get them before the May meeting,
Yeah.
we don't need to be in public to review them ourselves.
No, I mean,
We
very
could do
often
that.
they're kind of nearly there, and
Yeah.
then they're just so.
But they just don't get over that
Yeah,
the line, as it
yeah,
were.
yeah.
If you don't mind, Councillor
Not
Swinglehurst,
at
I'd
all.
be very grateful.
And this comes into, you just said about how much resources are put into this, and I assume you mean council resources. And I did, talking to Daniel earlier, I just wonder if they've got enough people, because this is a huge subject with all sorts of stuff going on. Have they got the manpower and skills necessary to meet all these objectives, to find out all this information, to give all these reports, or not?
The problem with the Economy and Environment Directorate, it tends to be at the end of the debate on social care and children's services. So it's only after we've really allocated the budgets to those two big beasts that we suddenly then look at what is there left for economy and environment.
And it shouldn't be, because this is existential.
I know. They have had reductions in the percentage that's allocated to them, not necessarily the absolute amount. And that must be hurting. It must be. And that's why I want us to have that topic, at least for part of our agenda meeting that we might have, just to start the debate rolling. Maybe just to ask these simple questions and get what answers we can, and then get them thinking about, well, how can we as a committee help the directorate to push for more resources within the next budget allocation, which, of course, while it doesn't get decided until February, happens way in advance, at least 6 or 7 months in advance, in terms of the horse trading that goes on. So I would like to at least start that debate, because it's very frustrating coming to full council, seeing the figures, talking about them every year, pointing them out every year, but not having any way of actually redressing the problem. And as you say, Councillor Highfield, the environment is key to us. It's not just key in terms of the existential threat. It's key to us in terms of our biggest part of our economy. It's one of the selling points for Herefordshire. And we don't seem to grasp that within the council. We don't seem to see that as a driver for allocating resource and then helping our tourist economy to actually expand and grow, which would have more of an impact on the wealth around here than a lot of the other economic developments that we do fund.
I've never quite understood why our scrutiny committee is called Environment and Sustainability, when the equivalent cabinet post is a different title and talks about economy. Is there a reason for that? What's I'm new, so what's the reason behind that?
It's an environment portfolio. That's Graham Biggs. Graham Biggs has economy.
The previous administration had economy and environment combined with
Yes,
a cabinet member,
and that
we've
didn't work.
separated
That didn't
them
work.
out. So I'm
Okay, I've still seen
environment.
documents labelled like that, so yeah, okay.
yeah. I
thanks.
think that's a hangover from. So the directorate is still economy and environment. So Ross Cook is the director of economy and environment.
Okay.
But there are two cabinet members that he deals with. One me and Councillor
Okay.
Biggs, the other one.
Okay.
Right, that leads me to the date of the next meeting. Now, this is the date of the next public meeting, which is the 22nd of July at 10 a.m. But we will come out as quickly as we can with other dates for you for our informal meetings. and for our May meeting, which will not be held in public, but will give us a chance to confirm and shall we say, expand our work programme for next year. Can I say I think that was an excellent piece of work by all of us. Net zero is not an easy topic. It's not easy to grab. It's very nebulous. And I think we did a pretty good job there. I know we shouldn't sign our own homework, but what's wrong with that occasionally? So I'd like to thank everybody who attended, including the officers, and Councillor Swinghurst as well, because she's always there. And I'd like to thank Daniel, Simon and Alfie for their support. And can we have the live stream switched off now and